You're listening to the Retire Coast podcast, where money, business, and lifestyle come together. Join us each week as we explore smarter financial planning, starting and growing businesses, and building the life you want at every stage, from millennials and Gen X to today's retirees.
Welcome back to another episode on our podcast talking about the 250th anniversary of the birth of the United States, and that'll be in July 2026. Actually, not on the 4th, but you need to read about that. This topic today is going to be about how the United States Navy was formed. I find it fascinating that most of our focus is on George Washington and all of the soldiers that fought all the different battles, such as the one where they went across the Delaware and many others. But we hardly ever hear about what happened on the sea. Did you know that we actually had a Navy that started in 1775? You probably didn't, but you're going to learn more about it in this podcast. You're going to learn about a unique individual named Esek Hopkins. He was the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. You probably haven't heard of him either. So it's time to give some credit to the Navy and not just continue to credit the Army, although all of them need credit for what they did during the war. But we're going to talk at length in this podcast about the Navy and its contributions during the Revolutionary War. And not just our Navy either. We'll talk a little bit about the British Navy, and we're going to talk about the French Navy, which really helped us win. But you need to know these things. If you believe that all of our history is focused just on the soldiers on the ground, well, you're going to hear a different story here, and this will help you with the entire story, because we have other podcasts and articles written on retirecoast.com that explain many aspects of the Revolutionary War and the battle for our independence. So I hope that you enjoy the presentation here. This is a dialogue, which I've been doing on some of these, where two people talk back and forth about all the aspects, and I think you're going to enjoy this. This is that type of article that is really something you can get into. It's not a how-to kind of article, but it's just great to know this information and feel pretty good and fuzzy about it. My family came over to the United States in the early 1700s, and some of the other ones came over in the middle 1800s, so I have a definite connection to what happened back then. Who knows? Maybe someone in my family way back then was on one of the ships in the Navy. I don't know, but I'm certainly grateful for their contributions. And even if your family came over way after that, they came to a country that they could set down roots and grow. And we need to be thankful for that. But this is not just that. It's a testimony to what happened back then and the resilience of these people. So join me in listening to this, and I hope that you get as much out of it as I did during the research. Thank you.
Imagine trying to defeat the world's undisputed superpower. And, not with a highly trained military, and definitely not with billions of dollars in stealth technology.
Right.
But with a handful of repurposed delivery ships, improvised weapons salvaged from junkyards, and a commander who, until very recently, used to basically be a state-sanctioned pirate.
I mean, it sounds like a heist movie gone terribly wrong.
Yeah.
If you pitched that to a modern defense contractor today, they would literally laugh you out of the room. It's just a completely absurd premise when you look at the raw logistics of it.
You would look at that lineup and just say, well, these people are doomed.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about a movie here. Uh-huh. We're diving into the actual messy, controversial, and completely improvised origins of the United States Navy.
Absolutely.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into an article from Retire Coast's America 250 series, and it's titled Esek Hopkins and the First American Navy, 1775. Our mission here is to explore the impossible task of building a military force out of absolutely nothing. And, more importantly, what happens when the people you hire to do it don't fit into a neat bureaucratic box.
To really grasp the magnitude of this, you have to strip away like every assumption you have about the modern American military.
Right, for sure.
Forget the aircraft carriers, forget the Pentagon. We have to go back to a moment when success was statistically highly improbable.
Okay, let's unpack this impossible reality. The year is 1775. The American colonies are in open rebellion, but they're facing a massive, glaring logistical nightmare. They have zero naval infrastructure.
None.
And I really want to emphasize what zero means here to you listening. No naval academies to train officers. No shipyards capable of churning out purpose-built warships.
Right.
No centralized command structure.
No.
I mean, they didn't even have standardized deck logs to record what was happening at sea. No doctrine, no strategy, just, well, nothing.
And you have to look at who they are challenging, right? The British Royal Navy. In 1775, this wasn't just a military branch. It was the most complex, lethal, and globe-spanning machine of war ever assembled.
Yeah.
The Royal Navy was the very reason the British Empire existed. Their ships were custom-built floating fortresses. They operated what were known as ships of the line.
Let's actually define that because it's a term thrown around in history books a lot. A ship of the line wasn't just like a big boat.
Oh, not at all. It was the 18th century equivalent of a nuclear deterrent.
Wait, really?
Yeah. A ship of the line was a vessel large enough, structurally reinforced enough, and heavily armed enough to take a place in the actual line of battle. We're talking ships carrying 70, 90, sometimes over 100 heavy cannons.
That is insane. Over 100 cannons on one ship.
Exactly. And their officers were put on ships as young boys, 12, 13 years old, and trained in this really rigorous, standardized system of mathematics, navigation, gunnery.
So they were basically bred for naval warfare.
Literally. They fought in strict, synchronized formations, delivering massive, coordinated broadsides that could just level a coastal city. They protected trade routes, transported troops, and crucially for the American colonies, they enforced blockades.
So if you are the Continental Congress, right,
Mm-hmm.
and you are trying to fight a war for independence on the North American continent, you are looking at a giant, impenetrable wall of British warships right off your coast. How do you even begin to circumvent that?
Well, you simply couldn't win a revolution on this continent without challenging British control of the water. It was a geographic impossibility.
Right, because of how spread out everything was.
Yeah, the colonies were strung out all along the Atlantic seaboard. The ocean was the highway. If Britain controlled the water, they controlled the flow of goods, weapons, information.
Everything.
Right. They could strangle the colonial economy, block vital gunpowder from coming in, and just move their own troops from Boston to New York to Charleston with complete impunity.
So the Americans realized pretty quickly that if we don't contest the water, the war on land is already over before it starts.
Precisely.
Since there was no established American officer corps to draw from, Congress had to look completely outside traditional military structures to find someone to lead this non-existent Navy. They needed someone who knew how to command a ship and keep a crew alive under extreme pressure.
Yes.
And that search lands on a guy named Esek Hopkins.
Esek Hopkins is a fascinating figure because he was a creature of the 18th century private sector. He was a merchant.
But let's be clear about what being a merchant meant in the 1700s.
Here.
We aren't talking about managing a fleet of modern cargo ships with, GPS and radar and satellite weather feeds.
Yeah, not at all.
He was navigating incredibly dangerous ocean routes, managing difficult crews who had been isolated at sea for months, and above all, protecting the cargo.
It was an incredibly demanding, volatile profession. As a merchant captain, Hopkins had to calculate risk on a daily basis.
Yeah.
He was making life and death decisions alongside massive financial decisions, completely independently, thousands of miles from his home port. He knew how to act without asking for permission, because if a storm hit or a hostile sail appeared on the horizon, there's no one around to ask.
Well, wait, so calling him a merchant kind of leaves out the most controversial part of his resume, doesn't it?
It definitely does.
I mean, the Continental Congress essentially hired a corporate logistics manager who dabbled in legalized piracy. He was a privateer during the earlier colonial conflicts.
Right, but we really need to differentiate between a pirate and a privateer here, because while they look similar on paper, the legal and strategic differences are profound in the 18th century.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. Isn't privateer just like historical rebranding?
No.
Well, it sounds like piracy with a government stamp on it. Why would the British or anyone else respect that distinction if they caught him?
That is exactly how the British often felt when they were losing. But in the established laws of war at the time, the distinction was everything.
Okay.
A privateer was a privately owned ship, officially authorized by a government, via this legal document called a letter of marque to attack and capture enemy vessels during wartime.
Got it.
A pirate, on the other hand, was an enemy of all nations, acting solely for personal greed, and if caught, they were hanged. A privateer was acting as an auxiliary arm of the state. If captured, they were technically supposed to be treated as prisoners of war.
The economic model of this is just wild to me. It wasn't just patriotism, right? It was a hardcore business venture. Privateers would capture these enemy merchant ships, which they called prizes, and bring them back to port.
And they didn't just loot them on the open water like pirates would. They brought them back to be formally evaluated by an admiralty court.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if the court ruled it illegal capture, the ship and its cargo were sold, and the massive profits were split among the privateer crew, the investors who funded the ship, and the government.
So it was a financial opportunity wrapped in a patriotic effort.
Exactly.
So this gave Hopkins actual combat experience. He wasn't just sailing cargo, he had hunted enemy ships. But it also instilled in him a highly aggressive, opportunistic mindset.
Very much so.
Privateers didn't line up in neat rows and trade cannon fire with warships. They favored speed, surprise, and independent action. They were essentially the guerrilla fighters of the sea.
They looked for the weak point, struck fast, and took the prize. If a heavily armed warship appeared, a privateer's job wasn't to fight it. Their job was to run away and survive to hunt softer targets.
Right.
Hopkins brings this entire best judgment, highly independent, profit-driven approach to military command. He was used to being his own boss.
Let's look at the political reality of this appointment, though. It wasn't just his resume that got him the top job. Hopkins was a member of the Rhode Island General Assembly.
Right.
And more importantly, his brother, Stephen Hopkins, was a former governor of Rhode Island and a sitting member of the Continental Congress. I mean, that screams nepotism.
What's fascinating here is that through a modern lens, absolutely, it's blatant nepotism. Today we demand strict meritocracies. But put yourself in the room with the Continental Congress in 1775.
Okay, setting the scene.
They are in a legal assembly committing high treason against the British Crown. If this revolution fails, every single one of them will literally hang from a noose.
Jeez. Yeah.
In that paranoid, incredibly high-stakes environment, leadership appointments were based on trust as much as merit.
Because you don't just need someone who knows how to sail. You need someone you absolutely know won't take the ships you just bought, sail them into New York Harbor, and, sell you out to the British for a royal pardon.
Precisely. Stephen Hopkins could personally vouch for his brother's loyalty, and it wasn't just his brother advocating for him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Hopkins had the backing of massive political heavyweights like John Adams and John Hancock. When the Marine Committee of the Continental Congress decided to create a naval force, they looked at Esek Hopkins and saw a rare combination: deep maritime capability, combat exposure, and ironclad political trust.
So John Hancock signs off, and Esek Hopkins is officially appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Navy. He basically becomes the first commander of what will eventually become the U.S. Navy.
He does.
Having selected this totally unconventional commander, Congress hands him an equally unconventional fleet. And by fleet, I mean an absolute scrapyard.
It really was the ultimate DIY military project. They didn't have time or resources to build warships from the keel up. So they went to the docks, bought used merchant vessels designed to carry tobacco, sugar, and timber, and just decided to strap cannons to them.
Let's break down these 4 core ships, because translating these specs into visceral realities is shocking. First, you have the flagship, the Alfred.
Right.
Originally a British merchant ship called the Black Prince, roughly 450 tons, carrying 20 to 30 guns and commanded by Dudley Saltonstall. Then you have the Columbus, another converted merchant vessel, similar size, maybe 20 to 28 guns, commanded by Abraham Whipple.
And those were the heavy hitters. But then you look at the supporting vessels.
Yeah, you have the Cabot, originally a merchant brig. Think about what it meant to be on the Cabot. You're in a wooden box, roughly the size of a modern tennis court, at 150 tons, carrying just 12 to 14 guns.
It's tiny.
Yeah. It was commanded by John Burroughs Hopkins. And finally, the Providence, a Rhode Island merchant sloop, highly agile, only about 100 tons and 10 to 12 guns, commanded early on by a young man named John Paul Jones.
We really have to talk about the structural impossibility of what they were doing here. A merchant hull is built entirely differently than a warship.
How so?
Well, a merchant ship is built wide and deep to maximize cargo space. A warship is built with incredibly thick oak sides to absorb incoming cannon fire and massive internal bracing to handle the recoil of its own guns.
Right, I'm looking at this from a structural perspective. If you put heavy cannons on a merchant ship deck that wasn't designed for it, when those guns fire, doesn't the recoil literally threaten to tear the deck apart?
It absolutely does. The recoil of a heavy cannon can shear the deck planks right off the frames. The ships become incredibly unstable. Furthermore, because these four ships varied so wildly in their size, their hull shape, and their sail plans, they all sailed at completely different speeds and turned at different rates.
It's the equivalent of trying to fight a coordinated tank battalion by rolling out 2 retrofitted cargo trucks, a delivery van, and a sports car with a machine gun bolted to the roof.
That is a perfect analogy.
If they try to drive in a straight line together, the sports car has to constantly slam on the brakes while the cargo trucks are redlining just to keep up.
Yes. Strict, formalized naval tactics, like forming a ship of the line, were physically impossible for this group. Hopkins couldn't command them like a traditional admiral. He had to deploy them almost like a pack of hunting dogs, using their individual quirks to his advantage.
And their arsenal really reflects this desperation. They didn't have standardized cast iron cannons perfectly calibrated for accuracy.
No, they had scavenged whatever they could find.
Exactly. They had salvage guns, captured guns, rusty iron pipes bought off private owners, and the ammunition was brutal. They fired solid iron shot designed to smash through wooden hulls and shatter masts.
Right.
But because their cannons were so inferior to the British, they couldn't win a long-distance artillery duel. They had to get close. And when they got close, they switched to grape shot.
Grape shot is horrifying. It's essentially a canvas bag or a metal canister filled with clusters of small, heavy iron balls.
Oh.
When fired from a cannon, the container breaks apart immediately upon leaving the barrel. The cannon basically acts like a massive shotgun.
So it spreads on impact. The goal isn't to sink the ship with that.
No, the goal is to sweep the enemy deck. It was designed to indiscriminately shred the rigging, smash the ship's wheels, and devastate the enemy crew at close range just moments before a boarding action.
And the boarding action is where it devolves into a medieval nightmare.
Yeah.
Because muskets and flintlock pistols took so long to reload, combat immediately turned into hand-to-hand fighting.
Yes, it was incredibly personal and violent.
They used cutlasses, short, curved blades, perfect for slashing in the tight, crowded quarters of a ship's deck. Officers used sabers. When they lost their swords, they used boarding axes, long wooden pikes, and whatever tools they could rip off the bulkheads.
It was pure chaos.
For these American ships, their best chance of survival was to endure the incoming fire, violently crash their ship into the British vessel, throw grappling hooks, and just overwhelm the enemy in a bloody brawl.
It underscores the sheer desperation of the whole enterprise. But there is a visual element to this early fleet that tells you everything you need to know about where their heads were at in 1775.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look up at the mast of Hopkins' flagship, the Alfred. What flag is flying over this desperate, bloody enterprise? It is not the Stars and Stripes.
No, it's not.
The very first American naval flag is known as the Grand Union flag. It has 13 alternating red and white stripes representing the United Colonies, but in the top left corner, the canton, where our Field of Stars sits today, is the British Union Jack.
Think about the intense cognitive dissonance of that flag.
I mean, you are loading a cannon with grape shot, preparing to fire it into the faces of British sailors, and you are flying the symbol of the British king right above your head.
It makes complete sense, though, when you realize that in 1775, they hadn't actually decided to declare independence yet.
Right. 1776 is a whole year away.
Exactly. The declaration isn't signed until July of 1776. When Hopkins takes command, the colonists are still fundamentally fighting as British subjects. They are fighting to demand their rights under the British Constitution. They are saying, we are Englishmen, and the Parliament in London is violating our rights as Englishmen.
They are heavily armed protesters complaining to corporate HR. They want management to change the policy, but they aren't ready to burn down the company yet.
That's a great way to put it. The Grand Union flag is the physical embodiment of that hesitation. The stripes say, we are united in our grievance. But the Union Jack says, we still recognize the king's sovereignty.
Like a psychological stepping stone.
It is. They had to fight their way to the realization that reconciliation was impossible.
So Hopkins has his improvised, retrofitted fleet, his mismatched cannons, and his profoundly confused flag. And because he knows this fleet would be instantly annihilated by the Royal Navy in open water, he has to find a target suited to his privateer mindset.
He needs a soft target.
Exactly. This leads us to the first major operation of the American Navy, the Nassau raid.
To understand the why of Nassau, we have to zoom out to the mainland. General George Washington is taking command of the newly formed Continental Army outside Boston.
Right.
But Washington has an existential crisis. His army is completely out of gunpowder. You can have all the motivated, patriotic soldiers in the world, but without gunpowder, they're just men standing in a field holding metal sticks.
Congress gets intelligence that there is a massive stockpile of British military stores, specifically the gunpowder Washington desperately needs, sitting largely undefended in the town of Nassau, on New Providence Island in the Bahamas.
It is the perfect target for Hopkins. It is far away from the heavy concentrations of the Royal Navy blockading the American coast, and it has exactly what the Revolution needs to survive. So Hopkins sails his fleet south in early 1776.
And what follows is historically recognized as the first amphibious assault in American history.
It is.
Hopkins arrives in the Bahamas in March 1776. He doesn't just bombard the town from the water, he actually lands troops. Marines and sailors go ashore, they march on Fort Montague, and they capture it.
It's an incredible moment of initiative.
It really is. They seize dozens of heavy cannons, mortars, and tons of military supplies. But then they reach the main powder magazine, and they discover a catastrophic flaw in the operation.
The primary objective was the gunpowder. But the British royal governor of the Bahamas, a man named Montfort Browne, had seen the American fleet lingering off the coast. While Hopkins was organizing his landing forces and sending demands for surrender, Governor Browne executed a brilliant stalling tactic.
How exactly did he sneak tons of highly explosive powder out of a fort under siege?
Well, he didn't sneak it past the Americans. He snuck it out the back door. While the Americans were landing on one side of the island, Browne had his men load the vast majority of the gunpowder onto 2 swift merchant ships anchored in the harbor.
Oh, no.
Yeah, under the cover of darkness, those ships slipped out through a different channel, entirely bypassing Hopkins' blockade. By the time the Marines breached the magazine, the powder was long gone.
They missed the entire reason they sailed to the Bahamas in the first place.
So I have to ask about the fallout here. Was there any coordination with George Washington on this? Because if I'm Washington, freezing in Boston, waiting for powder, and my new Navy commander lets it slip out the back door, I am livid.
It's a natural assumption, but there was no direct, ongoing collaboration between Hopkins and Washington.
None.
They operated in completely parallel tracks. Washington commanded the land, Hopkins commanded the sea. Most of their communication had to flow painfully slowly through the bureaucratic committees of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Washington wasn't micromanaging Hopkins' route or his tactics, so Washington wasn't actively tracking this raid.
No. They were working toward the same strategic need, but independently. And while Hopkins missed the bulk of the powder, the massive haul of cannons and heavy mortars he brought back was still desperately needed by the Continental Army.
Even missing the powder, the Nassau raid ended up being a massive, unexpected win symbolically, because Hopkins didn't just capture artillery, he captured a person.
A very important person.
He captured the royal governor of the Bahamas, Montfort Browne himself.
The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Capturing a sitting British royal governor was an incredibly audacious, almost unthinkable move.
Why was it such a big deal, though? I mean, it's just one local politician.
Because a royal governor wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was the literal, physical embodiment of King George III's authority in that colony. He represented the untouchable prestige, the invincibility of the British Empire. For an improvised fleet of rebels to sail into a British colony, breach the fort, march into the governor's residence, and drag the king's representative out and throw him into the brig of a converted merchant ship, it shattered the illusion of British supremacy.
The audacity is staggering. Governor Browne was brought back to the colonies as a prisoner of war. He was treated like a commodity and later traded in an exchange for captured Continental officers. It proved to the world and to the colonists themselves that the British Empire was vulnerable.
It demonstrated that colonial forces could strike far from their home waters. It forced the British to realize that none of their colonial outposts were safe, which meant they had to divert resources to protect them. It was a massive psychological victory.
But the irony here is thick. The very independent streak, that sheer privateer audacity that allowed Hopkins to capture a royal governor without explicitly asking Congress for permission, that is exactly the trait that made him entirely unsuited for what Congress actually wanted him to be.
It really is.
And this brings us to the downfall of Esek Hopkins. The inevitable clash of a privateer trapped in a bureaucrat's world.
Congress wanted it both ways. They created this ragtag navy, But then they expected it to act like the established, formalized Royal Navy. They expected rigorous coordination, strict discipline, and absolute adherence to their written orders.
But they hired a guy whose entire life experience and the very reason he survived at sea was based on rogue autonomy.
Exactly.
The complaints against him started mounting rapidly. He was accused of directly disobeying orders from the Marine Committee. He was accused of failing to aggressively pursue British warships when his fleet encountered them off the coast of Rhode Island. And most damaging, he faced an internal mutiny from his own officers.
To understand the mutiny, we have to look at the culture clash on those decks. Hopkins operated on instinct. He didn't hold councils of war to build consensus. He just gave orders. If you are a young, highly ambitious officer like John Paul Jones, who wants to build a professional, glorious career in a formal military hierarchy, working for a commander who acts like a secretive privateer captain is going to cause immense friction.
I have to push back on Congress's narrative here, though. Was Hopkins really a bad commander? Or was Congress just trying to micromanage a guy who was operating exactly how a privateer is supposed to operate?
That's a great question.
I mean, they handed him slow, brittle merchant ships, incapable of fighting a formalized war, but then censured him when he refused to fight a formalized war.
That is the core tragedy of his career. Congress gave him the tools of a privateer, but judged him by the standards of Lord Nelson.
Right.
When Hopkins encountered the British warship HMS Glasgow off Rhode Island, his disorganized fleet managed to damage it, but the Glasgow escaped. Congress was furious he didn't capture or sink it.
But with his ships.
Right. Hopkins' best judgment approach told him that chasing a heavily armed British warship through treacherous coastal waters at night with ships that couldn't maneuver properly was a recipe for losing his entire fleet. He chose to protect his assets.
A privateer avoids a fair fight because a fair fight isn't profitable. It just gets you killed.
Exactly. But Congress didn't want a cautious, calculating privateer. They wanted a heroic naval commander who would follow their orders to the letter, deliver decisive victories, and boost public morale, even if those orders were militarily suicidal.
The clash of cultures was fatal. Hopkins couldn't adapt to the red tape, and the politicians couldn't tolerate his independence. The end comes pretty unceremoniously. By 1778, Hopkins was formally censured by Congress and then completely removed from command. He is fired from the very Navy he helped drag into existence.
It's a bitter end for the first commander of the American Navy. But his removal did not mean the end of the naval war. In fact, it sparked an evolution.
Hopkins went home in disgrace, but the men he trained remained. The junior officers who chafed under his command, who complained about his lack of communication, took the painful, chaotic lessons they learned under him and used them to forge a new strategy.
The list of protégés who cut their teeth under Esek Hopkins is a who's who of future American naval legends. You have John Paul Jones, who would go on to terrorize the British coastline. You have Abraham Whipple, Nicholas Biddle, Dudley Saltonstall.
We often think that great leaders only emerge from the mentorship of perfect, flawless role models. But the reality of leadership development is that sometimes you learn the most by observing what not to do under a highly flawed boss.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is a profound truth. These young officers watched Hopkins clash fatally with politicians. They learned that a military commander must manage upward, communicating effectively with civilian oversight.
Oh, that makes sense.
They experienced the paralyzing effect of a mutinous crew, teaching them the vital importance of building trust and discipline amongst subordinates. They learned how to operate in extreme uncertainty with inadequate supplies, and how to maximize the specific quirks of bad ships. They absorbed his aggression, but learned to temper it with strategy.
And as these new leaders stepped up, the entire American naval strategy shifted away from trying to fight fleet-on-fleet actions. They realized Hopkins's fundamental instincts were right all along. They leaned entirely into what he was an expert in, commerce warfare.
This was the pivotal shift that slowly bled the British Empire. The Americans recognized that trying to outbuild the Royal Navy was impossible, so they authorized hundreds of privateers, and the Continental Navy vessels themselves focused almost entirely on raiding British supply lines.
They basically unleashed a swarm of mosquitoes on the British economy. American ships capture hundreds of British merchant vessels. But explain the mechanics of this. It's not just about stealing cargo, right? How does stealing merchant ships actually impact a superpower's ability to wage war?
It creates a cascading economic crisis. When American privateers start taking dozens, than hundreds of British merchant ships, the merchants in London panic.
Yeah, actually.
They go to maritime insurance markets like Lloyd's of London to insure their cargo. Because the risk of capture is suddenly astronomical, insurance rates skyrocket. Shipping becomes incredibly expensive. Profits plummet.
So the merchants start screaming at Parliament.
Exactly. The wealthy merchant class, who fund the government through taxes, start demanding that Parliament end the war because it's bankrupting them.
Wow.
Militarily, it forces a massive strategic diversion. The Royal Navy can no longer just blockade Boston and New York. They have to pull their massive warships away from the American coast and use them to escort slow-moving convoys of merchant ships across the Atlantic just to keep them safe from American privateers.
It's a death by 1,000 cuts. And this commerce warfare sets the stage for the final victory of the war. There is a common historical misconception regarding the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, which effectively ended the war. People assume the American Navy won the naval battle that trapped the British Army there.
That is completely false. The decisive naval engagement, the Battle of the Chesapeake, which trapped General Cornwallis and forced his surrender at Yorktown, was fought and won entirely by the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse.
Right.
The American Navy was practically non-existent at that battle.
The French delivered the knockout punch. But the connection here is vital. That French fleet was only able to achieve local superiority at Yorktown because years of American commerce warfare had fundamentally weakened the British naval posture.
Yes, absolutely.
The constant disruption of shipping, the bleeding of the British economy, the diversion of Royal Navy squadrons to protect trade routes, all of that stretched the British Empire so thin that a French victory became possible. Esek Hopkins' early flawed efforts helped start that long chain reaction.
But we cannot discuss the glory of privateering and capturing British ships without confronting the horrific, deeply dark cost of this strategy. Because going to sea against the Royal Navy carried a risk that is almost always overlooked in our history books.
This brings us to the most sobering part of this deep dive. When American sailors, whether they were serving in the Continental Navy or on privateer vessels, were captured by the British, they were not sent to a standard prisoner of war camp. They were sent into floating hellscapes known as the British prison ships.
They were called hulks. The British took aging, decommissioned warships that were rotting and no longer fit to sail. They stripped them of their masts, sails, and rigging.
Just floating shells.
Exactly. They anchored them in isolated waterways, primarily in Wallabout Bay, right off the coast of Brooklyn, New York. And they crammed captured American sailors into the holds of these dead ships. The most infamous, the most dreaded of these was the HMS Jersey.
The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that over 11,000 Americans died aboard these prison ships. 11,000. Let that context hit you for a second. More Americans died inside these floating prisons than died in actual combat on the battlefields during the entire Revolutionary War.
The primary cause of death for an American fighting for independence wasn't a British musket ball at Lexington or Saratoga. It was disease, starvation, and complete neglect in the pitch-black hold of a rotting ship just a few hundred yards off the shores of New York.
So what did this all mean? How did it get so bad? Why were they subjected to conditions that we would classify today as grotesque war crimes?
It comes back to the legal distinction we talked about at the beginning. The British government refused to view these men as honorable prisoners of war fighting for a legitimate nation.
Because they didn't recognize America as a nation.
Exactly. Because there was no recognized nation yet. They viewed them as treasonous criminal rebels. And by legally classifying them as rebels, they stripped them of the standard military protections, medical care, and rations that captured soldiers typically received under the 18th century rules of war.
I want to paint a visceral picture of what life on the HMS Jersey was like. We are talking about extreme, suffocating overcrowding. 1,000 men crammed below decks in spaces designed for a few hundred. In the summer, the wooden hulls baked in the sun, turning the hold into an oven with barely any ventilation. In the winter, they froze in the dark.
The sanitation was non-existent. Men were confined below decks for hours on end. Diseases like smallpox, yellow fever, and dysentery rampaged through the cramped quarters.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It was. The air was so toxic with human waste and sickness that the British guards refused to go below decks. Every morning the hatch would open and the guards would yell, "Rebels, bring up your dead." And the surviving prisoners would carry the bodies of their crewmates up to be buried in shallow, unmarked graves on the muddy shores of Brooklyn.
And the most psychological, insidious part of this torture was that the British offered them a way out.
Every single day. British recruiting officers would come aboard the hulks and offer the starving sick men a choice swear allegiance to King George III, enlist in the Royal Navy, and you can leave the ship today. You will be fed, clothed, and given a wage.
And the vast majority of them refused. They chose to stay in the dark, dying of dysentery, rather than turn their backs on the cause.
I want you to really imagine the psychological endurance that required. These weren't professional soldiers who signed up for glory. These were local merchants, fishermen, farm boys who took a chance on a privateer cruise to make some money.
Yeah.
They disappeared into these silent, rotting ships, and their families waited for years without ever knowing their fate. Their silent refusal to break, their willingness to endure the unendurable, was a profound testament to the ideological strength of the revolution.
It really is.
The true cost of systemic change, the real price of the independence we celebrate with fireworks, is so often borne in the shadows by people whose names are never carved into marble monuments.
It forces you to look at the revolution, not as a neat, tidy timeline of heroic victories, but as a grinding, agonizing, incredibly bloody struggle for sheer survival. Which brings us back to the man who commanded the very first ships of that struggle. We know Esek Hopkins was fired in 1778. But what happened to him? Did he get a redemption arc?
He did not. Unlike George Washington, who achieved godlike status and became the first president, or his own subordinate, John Paul Jones, who achieved international fame and rests in an ornate crypt at the U.S. Naval Academy, Esek Hopkins simply faded away.
Wow.
He didn't secure another military command. He didn't become a major political figure. He packed up his things, went home to Rhode Island, and lived out his days quietly. He was respected locally as a former sea captain, but he was entirely sidelined from the national narrative of the glorious revolution. He died in 1802.
It's an incredibly quiet end for a man who once commanded the entire naval force of a budding nation. But his legacy is far more complex than his unceremonious firing suggests.
This raises an important question about how we remember the flawed founders of our institutions. History, especially American history, loves a simple narrative. We want the flawless hero who overcomes adversity and wins the day.
Of course.
Esek Hopkins ruins that neat narrative. He was not a flawless hero. He was a difficult, aggressive, uncompromising man whose privateer mindset clashed fatally with the realities of building a formalized military.
But he stepped up when there was absolutely nothing, when there were no shipyards, no supply chains, no precedent, and an overwhelming enemy blocking the horizon. He took the job.
He laid the very first messy stones of the foundation. He proved that an American naval force could exist. And today, the modern United States Navy, which operates globally, utilizes nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, unmanned aerial vehicles, and supports space exploration, traces its direct, unbroken lineage right back to those 4 converted, leaky merchant ships and the man who tried to command them.
That's quite a lineage.
The Navy remembers him. They have named several USS Hopkins destroyers in his honor. There is a statue of him in Providence, Rhode Island, because despite his massive flaws, his role was undeniably foundational.
It really makes you appreciate how chaotic and fragile the beginnings of great institutions truly are. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time talking about the physical mechanics of this war. The heavy oak hulls, the grape shot tearing across the decks, the desperate search for gunpowder. We naturally focus on the weapons, but I want you to think back to the Nassau raid. Think about the psychological weapon Esek Hopkins deployed when he captured the royal governor, Montfort Browne. He didn't just defeat a British official, he stripped him of his aura. He threw him in the brig of a converted cargo ship and treated him like a tradable piece of inventory.
Yeah, that was huge.
Before the American colonies could successfully politically dismantle the British Empire on paper, they first had to mentally prove to themselves that the empire's elite were just mortal men who could be bought, sold, and traded. So we'll leave you with this. Did Esek Hopkins' greatest contribution to the American Revolution actually have nothing to do with naval tactics and everything to do with shattering the mental illusion of British invincibility?
That completely reframes his place in history. It suggests the war was won in the minds of the colonists before it was ever won on the water.
Something to think about the next time you see a painting of a flawless historical hero. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, look past the headlines, and keep challenging the neat and tidy versions of history. We'll see you next time.
I hope that you got something out of this and that you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll listen to our other podcasts about the 250th anniversary and listen to our podcast about lifestyle, finance, and some other topics. But please go to retirecoast.com, where we have the full written articles that have pictures, and they have all kinds of charts and graphs and things, especially the pictures are really interesting things about the ships at the time, for example, on this article, or about the weapons that they used. All of that can help with context. If you are a history buff like I am, you'll really enjoy our articles. We have a complete list of them. If you go to the homepage on retirecoast.com and just scroll down to our 250th, then you'll see the button to click. When you click that, it will list all the articles that we've written. I'm going to continue to write articles and publish podcasts through July of 2026. So please come back, enjoy both our podcasts and retirecoast.com. Thank you.